Smoke and mirrors, a city under siege. Smoke fills the air, a thick, acrid blanket. The sun, a hazy disk, struggles to pierce through. Beneath it lies Rafah, a city in ruins. Buildings once homes now stand as hollow skeletons, their interiors exposed like open wounds. The streets, littered with debris and shrouded in dust, are eerily deserted. Gone is the familiar bustle of life, replaced by an unsettling quiet, punctuated only by the distant thud of artillery and the drone of aircraft overhead. Rafah, a Palestinian city located in the southern Gaza Strip, finds itself at the epicenter of a conflict that has raged for decades. Caught between the borders of Egypt and Israel, it has become a focal point for tensions, a tinderbox waiting to ignite. The recent escalation in violence, part of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, has brought unimaginable devastation to this densely populated city. The weight of fear hangs heavy in the air. Families huddle together in what little shelter remains, their faces etched with anxiety and exhaustion. Children, their eyes wide with terror, cling to their parents, their innocence lost amidst the chaos. The constant threat of airstrikes and artillery fire has turned their world upside down, leaving them trapped in a nightmare they cannot escape. The situation in Rafah is dire. The relentless bombardment has crippled vital infrastructure, leaving the city without access to basic necessities. Hospitals, overwhelmed with casualties, struggle to cope with the influx of injured. Food, water, and medical supplies are running dangerously low, pushing the already vulnerable population to the brink. The walls close in a history steeped in conflict. To understand the current crisis in Rafah, one must delve into the complex and deeply rooted history of the region. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a protracted and multifaceted struggle, has shaped the lives of generations, leaving an indelible mark on the land and its people. The seeds of this conflict were sown in the early 20th century with the rise of both Zionism, a movement advocating for a Jewish state in Palestine, and Palestinian nationalism. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War led to the creation of the State of Israel and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, many of whom sought refuge in the Gaza Strip, including Rafah. The Six-Day War in 1967 resulted in Israel's capture of the Gaza Strip along with the West Bank and East Jerusalem. This marked the beginning of Israel's military occupation, which continues to this day. The presence of Israeli settlements and military infrastructure within these territories has been a major point of contention, fueling resentment and resistance among Palestinians. The First Intifada, a Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation, erupted in 1987. It was a watershed moment in the conflict, bringing the Palestinian struggle to international attention. The Oslo Accords, signed in the 1990s, aimed to resolve the conflict through a two-state solution. However, the peace process faltered, and the Second Intifada, marked by increased violence and suicide bombings, erupted in 2000. Shifting sands, the timeline of a crisis. The recent escalation in Rafah is the latest chapter in this long and bloody conflict. It is a story of escalating tensions, miscalculations, and a tragic loss of life on both sides. To fully grasp the magnitude of the current crisis, it is crucial to examine the key events that have led to this point. The current round of hostilities can be traced back to the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank in June 2014. Israel blamed Hamas, the Palestinian Islamist group that governs the Gaza Strip, for the killings, although Hamas denied involvement. The Israeli government launched a massive crackdown on Hamas in the West Bank, arresting hundreds of its members and sparking widespread protests. The situation escalated rapidly following the discovery of the bodies of the 3 Israeli teenagers. Rockets fired from Gaza into Israel increased, and Israel responded with airstrikes on suspected Hamas targets in Gaza. The situation deteriorated further when a Palestinian teenager was kidnapped and burned alive in Jerusalem, an act that sparked outrage and protests across the Palestinian territories. On July 8, 2014, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge, a military campaign aimed at stopping rocket fire from Gaza and destroying Hamas's military infrastructure. The operation, characterized by heavy airstrikes and a ground invasion of Gaza, resulted in widespread destruction and a high number of civilian casualties. Operation Protective Edge, a controversial campaign. Operation Protective Edge, the Israeli military campaign launched in July 2014, was met with international condemnation and sparked a fierce debate about the proportionality of the use of force in armed conflict. The operation, which lasted 50 days, left a trail of devastation in its wake, raising serious concerns about human rights violations and the targeting of civilians. The Israeli government justified the operation as a necessary measure to protect its citizens from Hamas rocket fire. They argued that Hamas, designated as a terrorist organization by Israel, the United States and the European Union, deliberately placed its military assets in civilian areas, using Palestinian civilians as human shields. However, human rights groups and international organizations criticized Israel's conduct during the operation, accusing the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, of using disproportionate force and failing to take adequate precautions to minimize civilian casualties. The indiscriminate firing of rockets into densely populated areas, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, and the use of heavy weaponry in residential areas raised serious concerns about potential war crimes. The United Nations Human Rights Council launched an independent commission of inquiry to investigate alleged violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law during the conflict. The Commission's report, released in June 2015, concluded that both Israel and Palestinian armed groups had committed serious violations, some of which may amount to war crimes. Amidst the ruins of Rafah, stories of survival and loss emerge, painting a harrowing picture of the human cost of this conflict. Eyewitness accounts from residents trapped in the crossfire provide a glimpse into the terror and despair that gripped the city. One resident, a young mother named Fatima, recounts the day her world was shattered. "We were at home preparing for iftar, the evening meal during Ramadan, when the bombs started falling," she says, her voice trembling. "The ground shook, the walls crumbled, and the air filled with dust. We huddled together, praying for the nightmare to end." Another resident, an elderly shopkeeper named Abu Ali, describes the scene in his neighborhood after days of intense bombardment. "The streets were littered with rubble, broken glass, and twisted metal," he says, his voice heavy with grief. "The smell of death hung in the air. I saw bodies being pulled from the wreckage, some of them children, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. The stories are endless, each one a testament to the brutality of war." A doctor working at a makeshift hospital describes the overwhelming influx of casualties. The majority of them civilians, many with horrific injuries. A teacher recounts the trauma of seeing her school, once a sanctuary for learning, reduced to rubble. These are the voices of Rafah, voices that deserve to be heard. The conflict in Rafah has exacted a heavy toll on its civilian population, leaving behind a legacy of physical and psychological trauma. The sheer scale of destruction is staggering. Thousands of homes have been reduced to rubble, leaving families homeless and displaced. Vital infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and power stations, has been severely damaged, crippling the city's ability to function. The human cost extends far beyond the immediate casualties. The psychological impact of living under constant threat, witnessing violence, and losing loved ones is immeasurable. Children, in particular, are vulnerable to the long-term effects of trauma, which can manifest in a range of psychological and behavioral problems. The United Nations estimates that over 100,000 people in Gaza have been left homeless as a result of the conflict. Many are living in overcrowded shelters, lacking access to basic necessities such as clean water, sanitation, and healthcare. The risk of disease outbreaks is high, posing a significant threat to public health. The international community has pledged millions of dollars in aid to Gaza, but the process of reconstruction is slow and fraught with challenges. The ongoing blockade of Gaza by Israel and Egypt has severely restricted the flow of goods and materials into the territory, hindering efforts to rebuild and recover. International outcry, a chorus of condemnation. The violence in Rafah ignited international condemnation, with world leaders and human rights organizations expressing grave concerns about the escalating conflict and its devastating impact on civilians. The United Nations called for an immediate ceasefire, urging both sides to exercise restraint and protect civilians. The United States, while expressing support for Israel's right to defend itself, also voiced concerns about the growing number of civilian casualties in Gaza. The European Union condemned the rocket fire from Gaza into Israel, but also criticized Israel's disproportionate use of force and its targeting of civilian infrastructure. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and other human rights organizations accused both Israel and Palestinian armed groups of committing serious violations of international humanitarian law. They called for independent investigations into alleged war crimes and urged all parties to the conflict to respect the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in attack. The International Criminal Court, ICC, announced that it would open a preliminary examination into the situation in Palestine, including the recent violence in Gaza. The ICC's decision was welcomed by Palestinian officials but condemned by Israel, which does not recognize the court's jurisdiction. Shifting blame. The politics of accountability. The conflict in Rafah, like many conflicts before it, became embroiled in a web of blame and counterblame, with both sides accusing the other of instigating the violence and committing atrocities. The Israeli government placed the blame squarely on Hamas, accusing the group of using Palestinian civilians as human shields and deliberately targeting Israeli civilians with rocket fire. Hamas, in turn, accused Israel of waging a disproportionate and indiscriminate military campaign against the Palestinian people. They argued that Israel's actions constituted collective punishment and amounted to war crimes. The group also pointed to the ongoing occupation and blockade of Gaza as the root cause of the conflict. The international community struggled to navigate the complex political landscape, with some countries siding with Israel, others expressing support for the Palestinians, and many calling for restraint and a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The United States, Israel's closest ally, provided unwavering diplomatic and military support to Israel throughout the conflict. The United Nations, while condemning the violence on both sides, faced criticism for its perceived bias against Israel. The UN Human Rights Council, in particular, was accused of singling out Israel for condemnation, while ignoring human rights abuses by Palestinian armed groups. Echoes of the past. The cycle of violence continues. The ceasefire, when it finally came, brought a fragile peace to Rafah. The guns fell silent, the airstrikes ceased, and an eerie calm descended upon the ravaged city. Yet the scars of conflict run deep, and the cycle of violence, deeply entrenched in the fabric of this land, threatens to erupt once more. The underlying issues at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remain unresolved. The occupation, the settlements, the blockade, these are the tinder-dry kindling awaiting the next spark to ignite them. And ignite they will unless a genuine and lasting peace can be forged. The people of Rafah, like countless generations before them, are left to pick up the pieces, to rebuild their lives amidst the ruins. Theirs is a story of resilience, of a determination to survive against all odds. But hope, that precious commodity, is in short supply. The international community, for its part, seems unable or unwilling to break this cycle of violence. Condemnations ring hollow, peace talks falter, and the status quo, untenable as it may be, persists. Until the root causes of this conflict are addressed, the people of Rafah, and indeed all those caught in this web of hatred and violence, are doomed to relive this tragedy time and again. A fragile hope, the long road to peace. The road to peace in Rafah, as in the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is long and arduous, paved with the wreckage of broken promises and failed negotiations. Yet, even amidst the ruins, a glimmer of hope persists, a belief that a different future is possible, a future where peace and justice prevail. Achieving this elusive peace requires a fundamental shift in perspectives, a willingness to move beyond the entrenched narratives of victimhood and blame that have fueled this conflict for far too long. It demands empathy, a recognition of the shared humanity that binds us, Israelis and Palestinians alike. A just and lasting peace must be predicated on a two-state solution, with an independent and sovereign Palestinian state existing side by side with Israel, both living in peace and security. This solution, endorsed by the international community, remains the only viable path to ending this decades-long conflict. The international community has a crucial role to play in facilitating this peace process. It must move beyond empty rhetoric and take concrete steps to hold both sides accountable for their actions, to prevent further human rights violations, and to create the conditions necessary for a just and lasting peace. The people of Rafah, and indeed all those yearning for a brighter future, deserve nothing less. The time for words is long past, the time for action is now.